The storm had been pounding the hospital windows for hours when Amara noticed her mother searching beneath the pillow. "Nneka, what are you looking for?" Her mother's trembling fingers moved desperately across the sheets. She looked frightened, not because of the thunder, but because whatever she was searching for seemed more important than the pain consuming her body. "Help me," she whispered. Amara reached beneath the pillow and found an old envelope, yellowed with age and sealed tightly. Her mother pulled it against her chest. "No. Not yet." Amara stared at her. For years, she had believed her father was a man who had abandoned them before she was born. Her mother had never spoken his name. Whenever Amara asked, Nneka would simply say, "Some people choose to leave." But tonight, everything was different. Nneka slowly pushed the envelope into her daughter's hands. "You must take this to the capital." "Why?" Her mother struggled to breathe. "There is an address inside." Amara looked down at the envelope. "Who lives there?" Nneka closed her eyes for a moment, gathering the strength to say what she had hidden for 25 years. "Your father." Amara froze. "My father is dead." "No," Nneka whispered. "He is alive." Thunder shook the windows. Amara felt her entire understanding of her childhood collapse in a single heartbeat. "You told me he left us." "I believed he did." "What do you mean, you believed?" Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "I was wrong about many things, Amara. But I was never wrong about loving you." Amara gripped her hand. "Then tell me the truth." Nneka turned her face toward the window. "I don't have much time." "Then please, don't leave me with another secret." For several seconds, there was only the sound of rain. Finally, Nneka reached beneath the blanket and pulled out a small photograph. It showed a much younger version of herself standing beside a sharply dressed man. His face was partly hidden by the photograph's damaged edge. Amara stared at it. "Who is he?" Nneka placed the photograph inside the envelope. "You'll know when you see him." "Why haven't you told him about me?" Her mother's expression broke. "Because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Nneka squeezed her hand. "Promise me something." "What?" "When you reach that address, don't tell him who you are." Amara frowned. "Why would I hide my identity from my own father?" "Because," Nneka whispered, "I need him to see that photograph before he sees you." Her breathing became weaker. Amara looked at her mother in confusion and fear. "And if he recognizes it?" Nneka's eyes filled with tears. "Then you'll finally know why he never came looking for you." The monitor beside the bed continued its steady rhythm as Amara clutched the sealed envelope. For 25 years, she had believed her father had abandoned them. Now, with her mother's life slipping away, she had only one question left: what if the man she hated for leaving had been searching for her all along? When her mother's condition finally stabilized, Amara brought Nneka home, but the fear of losing her never left. Their small house suddenly felt quieter than before, and every ordinary task seemed painfully important. Amara repaired the leaking section of the roof before the next rain, sorted through bottles of medicine on the kitchen shelf, and prepared meals that Nneka barely touched. She had spent her entire life believing that her father was a selfish man who had disappeared before she was born, leaving Nneka to raise her alone. Whenever Amara had asked about him, Nneka had given the same answer: some people choose to leave. Amara had learned to stop asking questions, but the sealed envelope sitting inside her drawer had reopened every wound she thought she had buried. One afternoon, while searching through her mother's belongings for an old medical document, Amara found a photograph hidden beneath a stack of folded clothes. She pulled it out and froze. It was another picture of Nneka, much younger, standing beside the same mysterious man from the photograph inside the envelope. This time, his face had been deliberately scratched away until almost nothing remained. Amara ran her fingers over the damaged image, her heart beating faster. Why would her mother keep a photograph of a man she claimed had abandoned them? And why had she gone to such lengths to destroy his face instead of simply throwing the photograph away? Amara turned it over, hoping for an answer, and noticed something strange engraved into the back. It was a small symbol she had never seen before, shaped like two interlocking circles with a sharp line through the center. Her hands began to tremble. She rushed to her room and pulled the sealed envelope from the drawer. Carefully turning it over, she stared at the back. The same symbol was engraved there. For the first time, Amara understood that the envelope was not simply a message from her mother. It was connected to something much older, something Nneka had spent decades hiding. And if the same symbol appeared on both objects, then the question was no longer whether her father had left them. The real question was why her mother had been so determined to hide the truth. Amara left for the capital the following morning with the sealed envelope, the photograph, and the address Nneka had given her. She carried almost nothing else, yet the small bag over her shoulder felt heavier than anything she had ever owned. As the bus moved away from the familiar streets of her neighborhood, Amara watched the modest homes disappear behind her and wondered what kind of man could be waiting at the end of that address. She had no idea that her journey was taking her into a world completely different from the one she had known. Hours later, the crowded streets of the city slowly gave way to towering glass buildings, expensive cars, private security gates, and enormous properties hidden behind high walls. Amara checked the address again, certain she must have made a mistake. Then she saw the massive iron gate standing ahead of her, guarded by two security officers. Beyond them was a sprawling estate surrounded by perfectly maintained gardens and tall trees. "I'm here to see someone," Amara said as she approached the gate. One of the guards immediately stepped forward. "Do you have an appointment?" Amara shook her head. "No, but I have an address." The guard glanced at the paper and then at her modest clothes. "You can't enter without an appointment." Amara reached into her bag and pulled out the old photograph. "I was told to bring this." Before the guard could respond, an elderly woman walking across the courtyard suddenly stopped. Her eyes locked onto the photograph in Amara's hand. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then the woman hurried toward the gate. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Amara looked at her carefully. "It belonged to my mother." The woman stared at the photograph as though she had just seen a ghost. "Your mother's name?" "Nneka." The woman's face changed completely. She looked toward the enormous mansion and lowered her voice. "You should not be standing here." Amara felt a chill run through her. "Why?" The woman glanced nervously at the guards before whispering, "Because that photograph belongs to a part of Mr. Adebayo's life that nobody is allowed to talk about." Amara looked beyond the gates. "Mr. Adebayo?" The woman nodded slowly. "Gabriel Adebayo." The name meant nothing to Amara yet. But the housekeeper's next words made her grip the photograph tighter. "For more than 20 years, Gabriel has kept one room in this mansion locked. Nothing has been moved. Nothing has been touched." She looked directly into Amara's eyes. "Whatever is inside that room, he has been protecting it all these years." Amara stared at the mansion, suddenly wondering whether she had come to find her father, or whether her father had been waiting for her without knowing she was coming. Gabriel Adebayo sat at the head of a long glass table while executives from 3 different companies waited for his decision. Numbers, contracts, and investment proposals covered the table, but Gabriel barely looked at them. "Cancel the meeting," he said suddenly. One of the executives blinked. "Sir, we still have several matters that need your approval." Gabriel stood and buttoned his jacket. "Then handle them without me." No one argued. They had learned that when Gabriel spoke in that tone, questions only made things worse. Later that evening, the mansion was filled with preparations for his birthday celebration, but Gabriel walked past the decorations without acknowledging them. He ignored the expensive cake, the flowers, and the guests waiting downstairs. Instead, he entered a quiet room at the far end of the house and stopped in front of an old wooden chair. The chair was empty. Gabriel stared at it for several minutes, his expression unreadable. He reached toward its backrest but stopped before touching it. Whatever memory lived in that room, he was unwilling to disturb it. A soft knock came at the door. It was the elderly housekeeper who had spoken to Amara at the gate. "Sir," she said carefully, "there is a young woman outside." Gabriel did not turn around. "Send her away." The housekeeper hesitated. "She brought something." Gabriel's eyes narrowed. "What?" "An old photograph." For the first time, the billionaire's composure disappeared. His hand slowly dropped from the chair. "What photograph?" The housekeeper described it, and Gabriel went completely still. He knew that photograph. He had not seen it in more than 20 years, but he could still remember every detail of it. The young woman standing beside him. The expression in her eyes. The day the picture had been taken. And the person who had disappeared from his life shortly afterward. "What does the girl look like?" he asked. The housekeeper described Amara's appearance. Gabriel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he turned away. "Don't let her in." The housekeeper looked confused. "But, sir, find out why she came here." He paused before adding, "And don't tell her anything about me." The housekeeper slowly left the room, leaving Gabriel alone with the empty chair. He finally touched its backrest, and his eyes filled with an emotion he had spent decades hiding. The photograph had returned. But what frightened him was not the memory it carried. It was the possibility that the past had finally found its way back to his door. Amara was finally allowed through the gates, but nothing about her arrival suggested that she belonged inside Gabriel Adebayo's mansion. A member of the household staff led her through polished hallways and into a spacious sitting room, then quietly left her there. Amara stood beside the expensive furniture, clutching the old photograph while trying to understand how her mother's secret had brought her into a world this wealthy. A few minutes later, a young woman entered. She was elegantly dressed, confident, and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had grown up surrounded by privilege. "I'm Elena," she said. Amara introduced herself, and Elena studied her carefully. "Why are you here?" "I need to speak with Gabriel." Elena's expression hardened slightly. "Do you have an appointment?" Amara shook her head. "No." Elena glanced at the photograph in her hand. "Then I assume you have another reason for being here." Amara sensed the suspicion immediately. "My mother sent me." Elena folded her arms. "And who is your mother?" Amara hesitated. "Neka." Something flickered across Elena's face, but she quickly concealed it. "I don't know anyone by that name." "Maybe your father does." Elena's eyes narrowed. She had spent years watching strangers approach Gabriel with sad stories, urgent requests, and carefully prepared explanations designed to reach his money. She wasn't cruel, she was protective. "If this is about money," Elena said quietly, "you should leave now." Amara felt insulted but remained calm. "I didn't come here for money." She placed the photograph on the table between them. "I came because my mother told me to find the man in this picture." Elena looked down. Before she could respond, footsteps sounded from the hallway. Gabriel entered the room. The moment his eyes fell on the photograph, all the color seemed to leave his face. He stopped several feet away. "Where did you get this?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Amara stared at him. "It belonged to my mother." Gabriel looked at her, then back at the photograph. "Neka?" Amara nodded. "You know her?" He swallowed hard. "I knew her a long time ago." "What was she to you?" Gabriel didn't answer. Amara stepped closer. "Why did she keep this?" Gabriel's eyes remained fixed on the photograph. "There are things about the past you don't understand." "Then explain them." He finally looked at her. "Not yet." Amara's patience broke. "You knew my mother. She is dying, and she sent me here for answers." Gabriel's expression changed when he heard those words, but he still remained silent. Then Amara turned the photograph over. Gabriel suddenly reached for it. His eyes locked onto the strange symbol on the back. For a moment, his breathing stopped. "This isn't complete," he whispered. Amara frowned. "What isn't?" Gabriel traced the edge of the photograph with his finger. "The message." He stared at the damaged corner. "There used to be another half." Amara looked at him in confusion. "What message?" Gabriel raised his eyes toward her. "The one your mother never wanted you to see." Years before Amara was born, Gabriel Adebayo had not yet become the powerful billionaire whose name commanded respect across the capital. He was simply a young businessman trying to build a future, and Nneka was the woman who made that future feel worth fighting for. They met before Gabriel's company became successful, when he still spent long evenings working from a small office and Nneka would bring him food because she knew he often forgot to eat. Their relationship grew quietly, built on simple moments rather than wealth. Gabriel loved her deeply, and for the first time in his life, he believed he had found someone who wanted him for himself. But his family never accepted Nneka. They believed she was unsuitable for the future they imagined for Gabriel, and they feared that marrying her would damage the family's reputation. At first, Gabriel defended her. He promised Nneka that nothing would separate them. But while he was struggling to establish his company, his family began working behind the scenes. Messages were hidden. Phone calls were blocked. Rumors were carefully planted. Nneka began receiving information suggesting that Gabriel had grown tired of her and was preparing to leave. At the same time, Gabriel was shown messages that made him believe Nneka no longer wanted him in her life. Neither of them knew that someone was controlling what they saw and heard. One evening, Nneka waited for Gabriel at the place where they had promised to meet. He never came. She believed he had chosen his family over her. Gabriel, meanwhile, waited for a message from Nneka that never arrived. He believed she had made her decision and walked away. Within weeks, their relationship was over. Nneka discovered she was pregnant, and Amara was born shortly afterward. Gabriel knew nothing about his daughter. He searched for Nneka for a time, but every path seemed to end in silence. As the years passed, he buried himself in work, eventually turning his struggling company into an enormous empire. But even after becoming wealthy, he never stopped carrying the wound of the woman he believed had left him. What Gabriel never knew was that several letters he had written to Nneka had never reached her. And what Nneka never knew was that Gabriel had written them at all. In a locked drawer, one of Gabriel's old letters still remained, its envelope marked with an address Nneka had never seen. Someone had intercepted the letters before they could reach her. And after 20 years, the truth was finally beginning to surface. When Amara returned home, she found Nneka awake, but something about her mother was different. Her breathing was weaker, and the strength that had briefly returned to her face was gone. Amara rushed to her bedside and took her hand. "Mama, what happened?" Nneka looked at her daughter for a long moment before whispering, "You went to see him." Amara froze. "How did you know?" A faint smile appeared on Nneka's lips. "Because I knew you would." Amara sat beside her and pulled the envelope from her bag. "You knew Gabriel. You knew exactly where he was. Why did you let me believe he abandoned us?" Nneka closed her eyes, and tears slipped down her cheeks. "Because I was afraid." She admitted that she had never truly hated Gabriel. For years, she had believed he had forgotten her, especially after every attempt to reach him ended in silence. But near the end of her life, she had discovered something that changed everything. One of the old letters Gabriel had written had somehow found its way back to her. When she read it, she realized that the man she had spent decades believing had chosen to leave might have been trying to reach her all along. Amara's voice trembled. "Then why didn't you tell him about me?" Nneka looked away. "Because by then, Gabriel's family had become powerful, and I was terrified they would take you from me." She explained that she had heard stories about the battles surrounding Gabriel's growing empire and feared that revealing Amara's existence would turn her daughter into another weapon in a family fight over wealth and control. "I thought I was protecting you," Nneka whispered. But I made a terrible mistake. Amara struggled to hold back her tears. You kept my father from knowing I existed. Neka nodded. Yes. Silence filled the room. Then Neka reached for Amara's hand. I cannot change what I did. I cannot give you back the years you lost. But I can give you the truth. Amara looked at her mother through tearful eyes. What do you want me to do now? Neka took a slow breath. Nothing for money. Nothing for revenge. And never choose him simply because he is rich. Her fingers tightened around Amara's hand. Go back and discover who Gabriel really is. Then decide for yourself whether he deserves to be your father. Amara lowered her head, crying silently. Neka continued, I don't want you carrying my anger after I'm gone. I want you to know the truth, even if the truth hurts. Her voice became barely audible. My last wish is not that you find a billionaire. It is that you find the truth. Amara held her mother's hand against her cheek, finally understanding that the journey was never about wealth. It was about a father and daughter who had lost 20 years to a lie, and whether the truth could give them even a small part of those years back. When Amara returned to Gabriel Adebayo's mansion, she expected answers, but instead she found a woman waiting for her in the main sitting room. She was older, elegantly dressed, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent her entire life being obeyed. My name is Victoria Adebayo, she said. I'm Gabriel's older sister. Amara immediately remembered Neka's warnings about powerful people surrounding Gabriel, and she remained cautious. Victoria offered her a polite smile. I understand why you came here. Amara studied her face. Then you know my mother? Victoria paused for just a moment. I knew Neka many years ago. The answer sounded carefully chosen. Gabriel suffered because of that relationship, Victoria continued. Whatever happened between them, he has spent decades trying to move forward. Amara frowned. My mother told me a different story. Victoria sighed as though she were preparing to reveal something painful. Your mother believed Gabriel abandoned her. Gabriel believed she abandoned him. The truth is probably somewhere between those two versions. Amara's suspicion grew. How do you know so much about what happened? Victoria looked away. Because I was there. She then began describing details about Neka that Amara had never told anyone outside her family. She knew where Neka had lived, remembered the small shop she once worked at, and even mentioned a blue dress Neka had worn when she first met Gabriel. Amara's stomach tightened. How could you possibly know that? Victoria smiled faintly. Some memories don't disappear. Then she leaned closer. But there is something you should understand. Gabriel has already suffered enough. If you came here hoping to become part of this family because of his wealth, you should leave before things become complicated. Amara's face hardened. I didn't come for his money. Perhaps you believe that now, Victoria replied. Money changes people faster than they expect. She walked away, leaving Amara unsettled. Yet Victoria had made one mistake. She knew too much. Meanwhile, in his private office, Gabriel was reviewing the information his investigators had gathered about Amara. Her birth records, her childhood address, her mother's medical history, and every detail they could legally uncover were spread across his desk. One document made his hands tremble. Amara's birth date was only months after the last day he had seen Neka. Gabriel stared at the date for a long time before opening another file. The photograph of Neka was beside him. The resemblance between the young woman in the old picture and Amara was impossible to ignore. Gabriel whispered, my daughter. But he still needed certainty. As he continued reading, he discovered something even more disturbing. Several records from the years surrounding Amara's birth had been altered or removed. Someone had worked very hard to erase pieces of the past. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, his face growing colder. For the first time, he began asking himself a question he had avoided for decades. If Neka had not abandoned him, and if Amara really was his daughter, then who had spent all those years making sure they never found each other? And why was Victoria so determined to convince Amara to leave? Gabriel knew that the photograph and the records were enough to make him suspect the truth, but suspicion was not the same as knowing the woman standing in front of him was truly his daughter. More importantly, he did not want Amara to choose him because she had discovered his fortune. So instead of telling her everything, he offered her a temporary position at one of his charitable foundations under the name of the organization rather than his personal connection to it. Amara accepted because she needed work and because she wanted to understand the world her mother had sent her into. She had no idea Gabriel was quietly watching from a distance. On her first week, Amara noticed an elderly employee sitting alone outside the office, holding an eviction notice. The man had worked for the foundation for years but had fallen behind on rent after paying for his wife's medical treatment. When Amara discovered that his request for assistance had been rejected because of a technical rule, she refused to simply accept the decision. Rules are supposed to protect people, she told the administrator. Not punish them when they need help most. She spent the afternoon finding another legal way to help him, even though nobody had asked her to get involved. Gabriel watched through a security report and said nothing. A few days later, a young intern was blamed for an expensive mistake made by a senior executive. Everyone was ready to dismiss the young man, but Amara noticed that the documents did not match his account. She investigated and discovered that someone else had approved the transaction. Instead of protecting herself by staying silent, she presented the evidence and cleared the intern's name. Then came the situation that affected Gabriel most. A struggling mother arrived at the foundation seeking help for her children. The available assistance was limited, and several employees suggested sending her away. Amara quietly removed some money from her own wallet and bought the woman groceries before helping her complete a new application. Gabriel watched the entire exchange from a distance. He remembered Neka doing the same thing years earlier when they had barely enough money for themselves. For the first time, he stopped seeing Amara as a question that needed an answer. He began seeing her as his daughter. But Gabriel still refused to reveal the truth. He wanted their first real connection to exist without the weight of his fortune. What he did not know was that Victoria had also begun watching Amara. She noticed how quickly Gabriel's attention was shifting toward the young woman and understood what that could mean for the family. The closer Gabriel came to the truth, the more dangerous Amara's presence became. And while Gabriel was preparing to tell his daughter who he really was, Victoria was preparing to make sure Amara never discovered it. Amara discovered the truth by accident. She had stayed late at the foundation to finish some paperwork when she noticed a security report left open on a computer. Her name appeared on the screen, followed by dates, locations, and detailed notes about every situation she had encountered during her time there. At first, she couldn't understand what she was seeing. Then she noticed the name of the person who had authorized the monitoring. Gabriel Adebayo. Her stomach dropped. She suddenly remembered every strange moment when she had felt someone watching her, every question that seemed too specific, every opportunity that had appeared at exactly the right time. It had all been arranged. Furious, Amara walked straight into Gabriel's office and placed the report on his desk. "Was this your idea?" Gabriel looked at the papers and immediately knew there was no way to explain it away. "Amara, let me explain. You watched me." Her voice shook with anger. "You put me in that foundation, watched everything I did, and waited to see what kind of person I was." Gabriel stood slowly. "I needed to know who you were. You could have asked me," she shouted. "Instead, you treated me like an experiment." Gabriel had faced hostile investors, political pressure, business failures, and enemies who wanted his empire destroyed, but nothing prepared him for the pain in Amara's voice. "You're right," he said quietly. "I was wrong." Amara stared at him. "Why did you care so much about who I was?" Gabriel looked down for several seconds. Then he finally said the words he had been afraid to speak. "Because I believe you may be my daughter." The room went silent. Amara felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath her. "Maybe," she whispered. "After everything you've done, you still don't know." Gabriel's eyes filled with tears. I have spent 20 years believing the wrong story about your mother. I cannot make another mistake with you. Amara shook her head. You already did. Gabriel took a step toward her, but stopped when he saw her expression. I didn't know you existed. But now you do. Her voice broke. And instead of telling me, you tested me. Gabriel had no defense. For the first time, the billionaire who could solve almost any problem with money stood helpless before a woman who wanted something money could never purchase. I was afraid, he admitted. Afraid that if I told you the truth, you'd only see my wealth. Afraid that you'd hate me. Afraid that I'd lose you before I ever had the chance to know you. Amara wiped her tears. You don't get to ask me to forgive 20 years in one conversation. Gabriel nodded slowly. I know. She picked up her bag and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned back. If you really are my father, then stop trying to prove it with money. Start proving it with the truth. The door closed behind her, leaving Gabriel alone in the silence. For the first time in decades, he understood that possessing everything in the world meant nothing when the one person he desperately wanted to keep had every reason to walk away. Gabriel found Amara the following evening standing alone near the entrance of the mansion. He did not try to defend himself or ask her to forgive him. Instead, he simply said, there is something you need to see. Amara hesitated, but eventually followed him through a quiet hallway she had never entered before. Gabriel stopped in front of a tall wooden door and pulled an old key from his pocket. The lock turned with a heavy click. This room has been closed for more than 20 years, he said. When the door opened, Amara stepped inside and immediately stopped breathing. The room was filled with memories. Shelves held unopened birthday gifts, old photographs, handwritten letters, and packages that had never reached their intended destination. On one table were records of addresses Gabriel had searched, names of people he had contacted, and dates showing years of attempts to find Nneka. Amara picked up a small wrapped box. A faded note was attached to it. For my daughter, if I ever find her. Her hands began to shake. You knew about me? Gabriel's eyes filled with tears. I suspected you existed. I never knew where you were. Amara opened another box and found a child's bracelet still wrapped in tissue paper. Gabriel had purchased it decades earlier, long before he ever knew what his daughter would look like. One by one, the objects destroyed the story Amara had carried all her life. Her father had not simply forgotten them. He had searched. He had waited. He had kept every trace of the family he believed he had lost. Then Amara noticed something strange. Among the letters was a list showing the dates Gabriel had written to Nneka, but one final entry had no letter attached to it. Where is this one? She asked. Gabriel looked at the empty space. His expression changed. That was the last letter I ever wrote. What happened to it? I don't know. Amara looked around the room. If all the others are here, why is that one missing? Gabriel slowly shook his head. I thought Nneka received it. Amara's eyes narrowed. But she didn't. The realization struck both of them at the same time. Someone had taken the final letter before it could reach Nneka. Gabriel walked toward the shelves, suddenly seeing the room differently. For 20 years, he had believed their separation was a tragedy caused by misunderstanding. Now he wondered whether someone had deliberately created that misunderstanding. Amara thought of Victoria and remembered how easily she had described details about Nneka that only someone close to the family could have known. Her anger did not disappear, but it changed. She was no longer certain that Gabriel had chosen to leave them. And somehow, that hurt even more. Because if he had truly wanted her, then 20 years had not been lost because her father didn't care. They had been lost because someone had made sure he never got the chance to know her. That night, Gabriel called Victoria, Elena, and several trusted members of the family into the mansion's main room. Amara stood quietly near the window, still holding the final piece of her mother's photograph. She did not know what Gabriel intended to do, but the look in his eyes told her that something had changed. Victoria entered with her usual calm expression, but the moment she saw the document spread across the table, her confidence disappeared. Gabriel placed an old bundle of letters in front of her. "Do you recognize these?" Victoria stared at them without answering. Gabriel continued, "These were written to Neka more than 20 years ago. They were never delivered." Victoria's face tightened. Before she could respond, an elderly former employee stepped forward and placed a small ledger beside the letters. "I kept a copy," he said quietly. "I was afraid to speak before now." The ledger contained dates, names, and instructions showing that Victoria had ordered Gabriel's letters to be intercepted. It also showed that messages from Neka had been withheld from Gabriel. Amara looked at Victoria in disbelief. "You knew?" Victoria finally raised her chin. "I did what I had to do." Gabriel's voice became cold. "You destroyed my family." "I protected your future," Victoria replied. "Neka was never suitable for you. You were building an empire. She would have become a weakness." Elena stared at her aunt in shock. "And Amara?" Victoria looked toward the young woman. "I believed she would eventually become a problem too." Amara felt tears gathering in her eyes, but she refused to look away. "You decided that before you even knew me." Victoria's expression hardened. "I was protecting everything this family had built." Gabriel stepped forward. "No. You were protecting control." Victoria tried to defend herself, insisting that Gabriel would never have become the man he was if he had followed his heart. But Gabriel shook his head. "You didn't protect me. You stole choices from me." He looked at Amara, and his voice softened. "But I have to admit something too." Amara watched him carefully. "I was so focused on building my company and so afraid of losing Neka that I accepted the silence too easily. I should have searched harder. I should have questioned what I was told. Even if someone deceived me, I allowed 20 years to pass." His eyes filled with regret. "That part is mine." Amara finally understood the full truth. Victoria had created the separation, but Gabriel's fear and passivity had allowed the distance to survive. No single person could carry all the blame. Gabriel turned toward Victoria. "Family does not give you the right to destroy another person's life." Victoria had no answer. The room fell silent. Amara looked at the father she had spent her entire life believing had abandoned her. She finally knew the truth. But the truth could explain 20 years. It could not give them back. And that realization hurt more than anything she had expected. After the truth about Victoria finally came to light, Gabriel tried to fix everything the only way he knew how, with money. He offered Amara a house, financial security, a place in his company, and enough wealth to ensure she would never struggle again. Amara listened quietly, then shook her head. "I don't need any of that." Gabriel looked genuinely confused. "You are my daughter. You should have everything I can give you." Amara's eyes filled with tears. "That's exactly what you still don't understand." She stepped closer and spoke softly. "I don't need you to become my billionaire father. I need you to become my father." Gabriel said nothing. For perhaps the first time in his life, he understood that there was a problem money could not solve. He could buy the house Amara had never owned, but he could not buy the bedtime stories he had missed. He could pay for every education she could ever want, but he could not recover the birthdays when she had wondered why her father never came. He could give her an inheritance, but he could not give her back the 20 years that were already gone. So Gabriel stopped trying to compensate for the past with possessions. Instead, he began showing up. He visited Amara without an entourage, without expensive gifts, and without business proposals. Sometimes he simply sat with her while she prepared dinner. Sometimes they walked through the neighborhood and talked about ordinary things. Their first real meal together happened in a small restaurant far from Gabriel's mansion. There were no private rooms, no cameras, and no staff waiting nearby. Gabriel looked slightly uncomfortable as he studied the simple menu. Amara smiled for the first time. "You've never eaten somewhere like this, have you?" Gabriel laughed softly. "Not in a very long time." They ordered simple food and spent the evening talking. Gabriel asked about her childhood, her favorite memories with Neka, the dreams she had given up, and the things that frightened her. For once, he didn't try to solve anything. He simply listened. When they finished eating, Gabriel reached for the bill, then stopped himself. Amara noticed and smiled. "You're learning." He smiled back. Slowly. As they walked outside, Gabriel realized that the ordinary evening had given him something his fortune never could. He had not bought his daughter's forgiveness. He had earned one small moment of trust. And for the first time, he understood that becoming her father would not happen in a single conversation. It would happen one ordinary day at a time. Amara returned to the hospital the next morning, carrying the quiet hope that she would finally be able to tell Neka everything. She wanted to tell her that Gabriel had searched for them, that the truth about Victoria had finally been uncovered, and that the father she had spent her life resenting had never stopped wondering where they were. But when Amara entered the room, she immediately knew something had changed. The bed was still, the room was quiet, and the monitor beside it had been turned off. Neka had passed away peacefully before Amara could return. Amara stood frozen in the doorway, unable to accept that the woman who had been beside her only hours earlier was now gone. She walked slowly to the bed and sat beside her mother, holding her cold hand as tears finally broke through years of strength. "Mama, I found him," she whispered. "I know the truth now." A nurse quietly entered the room and placed a folded piece of paper into Amara's hands. "Your mother asked me to give you this when you came back." Amara recognized Neka's handwriting immediately. With trembling fingers, she opened the note. Her mother had written that she never wanted Amara to choose between her parents. She did not want her daughter to hate Gabriel simply because she had been afraid to face the truth. She wanted Amara to understand that love could survive mistakes, but only when people were brave enough to stop hiding from the truth. Amara pressed the letter against her chest and cried. She finally understood why Neka had sent her on this painful journey. Her mother's last wish had never been about finding a billionaire father or gaining access to a wealthy family. It was about making sure Amara did not spend the rest of her life carrying the same unanswered anger that Neka had carried for decades. Amara looked toward the empty chair beside the bed and whispered, "I forgive you, Mama." She could not change the past, and she could not bring her mother back. But she could choose what happened next. For the first time, the sealed envelope no longer represented a mystery. It represented the final gift Neka had left her, the truth. And although that truth had arrived too late to save her mother, it had arrived in time to save Amara from spending the rest of her life believing that she had been abandoned. Months later, Gabriel Adebayo was still a billionaire, but Amara had slowly begun to notice that he was no longer living like a man trying to control everything around him. He still ran his companies and carried the responsibilities of his empire, but he no longer measured love through expensive gifts or grand gestures. Instead, he showed up for the ordinary moments. He visited Amara's home, helped her with small repairs, listened when she talked about Neka, and learned which foods she liked without asking his staff to prepare them. Elena also began to change. At first, she had kept her distance, still unsure whether Amara truly wanted a relationship with their family. But over time, she realized that Amara had never asked for Gabriel's money, his company, or his inheritance. She only wanted the father she had spent her life believing she had lost. One evening, Elena sat beside Amara and quietly said, "I was wrong about you." Amara smiled. "You were protecting him." Elena nodded. "I just didn't know you were someone he had been looking for all these years." From that night forward, their relationship slowly became something neither of them had expected, a genuine sisterhood. One quiet evening, Gabriel invited Amara into the private room that had once been locked for decades. The old chair still stood beside the window. Gabriel looked at it for a moment, then turned toward her. My whole life, that chair reminded me of someone I lost. He stepped aside. I don't want it to be empty anymore. Amara's eyes filled with tears as she walked toward him. Gabriel gently pulled the chair out for her. Will you sit with me? Amara sat beside him, and for several moments neither of them spoke. On the table was the old photograph of Gabriel and Nneka, carefully restored. The damaged portion that had once hidden Gabriel's face had been repaired, allowing the young man in the picture to be seen clearly again. Amara took out a new photograph and placed it beside the old one. It showed herself standing beside Gabriel, with Nneka's memory represented by the small photograph between them. Gabriel stared at it silently. She should have been here, he whispered. Amara nodded. But she brought us here. Gabriel reached for his daughter's hand, and this time Amara did not pull away. The old photograph had once represented everything their family had lost. Now, beside the new one, it represented something different. Not a perfect family. Not a life without pain. But a family that had finally chosen to remember the truth instead of running from it. The old envelope remained in Amara's home long after everything had changed. It was empty now, its purpose finally fulfilled. Sometimes she would hold it in her hands and remember the night Nneka had pressed it against her chest and begged her to find the truth. She had once believed that envelope would lead her to money, answers, or perhaps even the father she had spent her life resenting. Instead, it had led her to something far more valuable. Amara had never become important because Gabriel Adebayo was a billionaire. She had been worthy long before she knew his name. She had been worthy when she and Nneka lived with very little, when she repaired their roof, when she cared for her mother, and when nobody knew where she came from. Gabriel had also learned that being her father was not something he could purchase with a fortune. He had to earn it through presence, patience, and love. He could never recover the birthdays he missed, the questions he never answered, or the years that disappeared between him and Nneka. But he could choose not to waste another day. And he did. He became part of Amara's life not as a billionaire trying to provide everything, but as a father learning how to simply be there. Sometimes they spoke about Nneka. Sometimes they sat together without saying anything at all. And whenever Amara looked at the restored photograph, she no longer saw only the years that had been stolen from them. She saw the courage it had taken to uncover the truth. Nneka had died before witnessing the family she had spent so long trying to protect come together, and that sadness would always remain. But Amara no longer carried the bitterness her mother had feared she would inherit. She carried the truth instead. Her mother's final wish had not given her a billionaire father, a mansion, or an inheritance. It had given her the chance to understand the past, forgive what could be forgiven, and choose what kind of future she wanted. And perhaps that was the greatest gift Nneka could have left her. Because sometimes the greatest fortune is not the wealth waiting for you at the end of a journey. Sometimes, it is finally discovering that you were loved all along.